Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you, Patricia. Thank you, everybody, for coming on this cold night.
It is freezing.
And thank you, Amelia, for driving from Kentucky all the way here. We, just as a brief intro, Amelia and I were on a panel at the Kentucky Book Festival this summer. And there were a couple other people on the panel, and I just wanted to talk to Amelia. and so we didn't get enough time talking together. And so we
brought it here.
We brought it here instead. Our two books are intersected. They intersect through this world of mental illness. So we're gonna talk a little bit about that. But first, Amelia, would you like to do a little reading?
Sure, I would love to. Before I begin, I'll just start with my book, Enough, a memoir of mistakes, mania, and motherhood, is really a story of hope, first and foremost. And it is about being able to overcome, despite the diagnosis of PTSD and bipolar disorder. And it gives a quite vivid view of what it's like to live with those conditions. So I will begin where I end, so we get a feel of what Enough is about.
It's an amazing book. It will make you cry.
Should I say what I always say?
Cry.
Should I say what I always say, like when I talk about your book?
No.
You're making it into a movie. It's so good. But the book's better. Okay, here we go. My thoughts are set. Oh, now I know why that looks weird. Okay. My thoughts are suddenly heavy. I think about the violation that brought incomparable pain and suffering, and of the perpetual illness that hovers around me like a veil. The pain is large, massive, engulfing me. The rape altered me, and yet every day is an opportunity to get back up and keep walking. I've given up all notions of why, and I'm inclined to look toward what now. I have been the best mother I can be, and I'm strong for fighting bipolar while being present for my children. I throw the rock as far as I can, consciously sending with it the limiting constructs of good and bad that have so defined my life. The shame and guilt still live inside me, but they're more like a bout of food poisoning when they show up. Overwhelming, yes, but also to be purged. Now I know how to fill myself, to rehydrate. I watch as dust blows into the air when my rock collides with the ground in the distance, then settles safely against another rock to remain in its new existence. As we walk away through the desert, I know that much relies on me. My life isn't perfect, but it is mine to steer. I have a choice. We walk to a nearby swimming hole as we follow the water in the stream. My daughters are ahead of me, speedily walking in the stream over the rocks, and I start to get anxious. Daniel is ahead of the girls, making sure it is safe. I stop and breathe. I am determined to enjoy this moment with my family. I'm reminded of all the life choices I've made in the past, foregoing things because I couldn't handle my mental state. But this time, something different happens. I'm staring straight ahead, and I see my girls joyful and excited by the wilderness. I take my next steps. With every step, the anxiety seems to spill into that stream. I step closer and closer to my children. I realize I've got this. I can do this. I can do difficult things. And I will keep at it with the mindfulness born of the pain. Mental illness is a part of who I am, but it's not me. We leave Sedona after our swim and start back to Kentucky. My home, the sweet bluegrass. We drive across the country, thousands of miles through the beautiful West. As we cross the Kentucky state line, relief fills me, surprising me. But I recognize this feeling. I'm home. The life I have built is here, right now. It resides here. Who knows what the future holds? One thing is certain. I'm no longer wanting, no longer lost, no longer inadequate. I have had enough. I am enough.
Can I ask you a question first?
Sure.
So your book is so powerful in terms of the exploration of yourself in your process of self-discovery, of your challenges, your mental health challenges along the way. What was it like to write that stuff and reveal it to everyone?
That is something I think about a lot. I think writing it at first glance was cathartic. It was a release that I was finally out with this secret. I'm no longer holding back on life. And so I was sharing the secret. But then I think when I decided to publish it, something different happened. There's this whole reckoning that I had to face with going public with my story. I was forced to own my truth, to finally say that I am accepting of my state of being, of my past and how I've overcome, and I am here today. And I was able to say that this is where I am, and I'm no longer hiding in shame or guilt. And I think that was what writing the book was all about. It's about owning my truth and then being able to live it.
So was there a moment, a threshold where you realized that you had to tell this story?
This book is dedicated to my two daughters. And it came to existence because of my daughters. I have two beautiful young daughters. They are 8 and 6. The most beautiful that you've ever seen. Like, I don't care what your kids look like. Mine are the most precious, beautiful children, but I kid. But they are beautiful, and
my kids are beautiful too.
Not as beautiful as mine. But yeah, so I mean, like they're so magnificent in their being, so pure and innocent and like untouched by the world. They're still growing into the people that they're going to be. But I know that the world is not ready for my children's magnificence. The world is a place where people who experience sexual assault are ostracized, like I was. People who have mental illness are ostracized. And I wanted to be part of conversations that change that for my children and children like them, and going forward, everyone, so that we can live the lives that we imagine for ourselves. Which I think also your book inspires, creating change and lasting change and imagining a world that is different. So maybe we can hear a little bit from the other Dr. Gilmer.
Sure, thank you. What happened next has never been fully explained. Sometime that night, they stopped at an Arby's for dinner, Dalton's first meal in over a year. Sometime that night, Dalton turned to Vince and began to hum the song, Baba Black Sheep. Sometime that night, Vince wrapped the dog leash around Dalton's neck. By the time a report was filed with the Washington County Sheriff Department, Dr. Vince Gilmer was already back in North Carolina, over 100 miles away. He'd driven south in the pre-dawn on the winding two-lane country roads and slightly straighter highways that penetrate the heart of Appalachia. He'd passed through the moonlit shadows of the Blue Ridge Mountains, through fog-filled hollers and sleepy mountain communities, crossing the North Carolina state line through the Cherokee National Forest. Ask Vince how he got home that night, and he probably wouldn't be able to tell you. The precise route is lost to time, lost to the shadows, lost to darkness. The day after killing his father, Dr. Vince Gilmer worked a full day, 8 in the morning to 6 in the evening. And no one, not his nurse, not his receptionist, not a single one of the 15 or so patients he saw that day noticed anything different about him. I now worked in that same clinic. I know some of the previous staff. I see Dr. Vince Gilmer's patients. I use his exam rooms. I'm Dr. Benjamin Gilmer, and though we are not related, for the last 13 years, I've lived in the other Dr. Gilmer's shadow. I know his story better than anyone except for Vince himself. It's a complex, twisting, and often frightening tale. To many people, it just doesn't make much sense. Why did a caring doctor become a brutal murderer? A few weeks after Vince killed his father, mine officiated at my wedding on a North Carolina mountaintop, a short drive from Watauga Lake, where the murder had occurred. I was looking forward to starting a family, and my professional life was Dr. Gilmer. Back then, I had no idea there was another Dr. Gilmer. I had no idea what the other Dr. Gilmer had done. I had no idea that it would change both of our lives forever. So you're probably wondering, what is the connection between our two stories? And the brief sort of overview of the other Dr. Gilmer is a story about starting my career in medicine as a fledgling doctor, family medicine doctor at Mayheck, realizing that I had met the Dalton Gilmer, the father of Vince Gilmer, back in 2003 when I was a medical student. Had no idea that our lives would intersect, nearly a decade later. Had no idea that I would start my first professional life, my job, following the footsteps of a murderer with the same name. And I became very curious about who this other person was, like why the other Dr. Gilmer did this, because his patients loved him, adored him. They wanted me to be more like him. They gave me tips about what the other Dr. Gilmer did, and they wanted me to do the same. So he was a very special person in that community. And I became deeply curious about wanting to discover who the other Dr. Gilmer was and trying to figure out, because I thought in my mind, I knew what happened to him. And the book is a story about figuring out what happened to the other Dr. Gilmer and discovering mental illness and what mass incarceration looks like in our country. So it was a big indoctrination story for me, a discovery of the dark side of mass incarceration, and really discovering, firstly as a doctor, but then as someone who became very proximate to mental illness, discovering how mental illness affects so many people and how we're all on this trajectory towards mental illness at various times in our life. So I wanted to ask you, Amelia, firstly, a question about that, because in my mind, mental illness is not something that's normalized. It's not normalized through the civilization that we know, but as physicians, we normalize it because we see it as a disease. What are your thoughts about that? About how you have been perceived through your discovery of your own mental illness, and how others see that?
So this is where I tell my story as it is, and I was bound by the stigma around mental illness, and I believed the stigma. I believed that people who had bipolar disorder were not going to be able to hold jobs, relationships, or have children, or even just live a normal life, whatever normal is, right? So I believed the stigma, and I believed that I knew what it looked like to be mentally ill, girl interrupted style. Like they're in straitjackets and like they're in the hospitals and they are in need of constant supervision or medication and all these things that were very taboo to me at the time, and not understanding what it meant to receive treatment for mental illness. And I hesitated, I resisted receiving treatment for a long time until I was at a point in my life where I saw a possible future. I saw a possible future, and I decided that I wanted to be part of that future with my now husband. We were dating then, and I realized that there was something different about a future that could be possible without this struggling with the challenging symptoms of mental illness. And so I let go of the stigma, I guess. I let go of the stigma, and I decided to move forward with treatment. But I think for a lot of us, we are silenced because of the stigma, which is still, I think it's still true. I think we are moving further along. I think we're talking about it much more. We hear about more mental illnesses on TV or radio, in the papers, and like not the best depictions, of course. I would like to see more depiction of people who are successful being treated for their mental illness and being successful at life and being able to thrive. But what we see usually is people who are ailing, or people who are incarcerated, or people which we need to talk about a little while in a little bit. We see a lot of negative depictions, and that just perpetuates the stigma. And so that's not helping this conversation. And I hope by sharing my life and parts of my life and the truth as best as I can tell it, that people are able to see that side of mental illness and how insidious it is. Yeah. So I have a question for you. So you have been like, from that short passage that you read, is very there's so many questions that comes up. Now I know that you have done a lot. You have done very well with This American Life, telling this story. I've always been curious about why you decided to write the book.
So that's an easy question for me, because both Amelia and I were not writers, like by trade or nature. There was a lot of nurture that went into writing this book rather than nature. And I wrote this book for one reason, and that was to convince the governor of Virginia, the Honorable Terry McAuliffe, to release the other Dr. Gilmer from prison. And there's a lot of backstory to that, of course, but that's why I wrote this book. I never would have had the audacity that Obama had to write his book. It would have felt crazy to have attempted to write a book, but I was so deeply inspired and angered by the governor of Virginia rejected our first clemency petition to get the other Dr. Gilmer out of prison after we had a clear diagnosis, after we had spent a decade understanding what happened to this man, and it was clear he should never have set one foot into a prison. He should have been placed into a mental hospital. And so that's why I wrote the book. And it was a deliberate effort to create something that would influence the media and hopefully the heart and mind of Governor McAuliffe. It failed. He rejected our clemency petition. And so then that was when I really started to practice writing. I didn't know how to go about this. I just started blindly practicing, sharing, etc. And when the next governor was elected, who was a neurologist governor, how does that happen? It was like a miracle that happened. And literally the stars were aligning. And he also rejected our clemency petition. And that's what kept me motivated to keep writing the story until we could give him a copy. And everybody in the governor's office got a free copy. They were the first to read it.
So we were talking about my experience with mental illness, right? And a lot of it has a lot of self-advocacy, things that I did for myself, that I fought for treatment, and the right kind of treatment, the right kind of meds, the right kind of doctors, the right kind of plans. And I talk about that in my book. And building a bridge between me and Vince Gilmer, right? He did not have a lot of insight into his illness before he was incarcerated. And I think he was trying to, but he was not able to get there. And I think with my message, I have been going on about looking for the right doctors to treat the ailment. And I feel like there is something to be said about proactively detecting your illness in order to avoid a circumstance. Like, I wonder if you thought that had he known that he had Huntington's, he would not have gone through all those things by himself and then end up committing murder and changing the trajectory of his life altogether.
So that was a little bit of a spoiler alert. Yeah. So this is interesting though, right? Like what makes people mentally ill? Like, is it is it purely the nature, or how much of it is the nurture? And I'm really curious about the parallels between all the different boulders that you confronted in your life, and how that compares to some of the events that happened in Vince Gilmer's life. Because Vince Gilmer was not born mentally ill. He was not born with an expression of this terminal neurologic disease that he inherited from his father. He was born into a life that had subsequent tragedy after tragedy throughout his life. Like, it was death by 1,000 cuts for him. And it's interesting to go back and look at his life and all the different insults that really began to trigger his mental illness. Now, later we learned that he has a deep neurologic process. But I think this is true, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. The insults that affect a child, an evolving teenager. Small things can be considered, absolutely profound influences on the psyche of a young person. Would you like to talk about some of those things?
Sure. So what Benjamin's talking about is I was sexually assaulted when I was 19 years old. So barely an adult, I guess old enough to do a lot of things, but not old enough to understand the consequences of situations that happened. And so I suffered in silence. And then in my early 20s, I received a diagnosis for bipolar disorder. Again, something that I had no understanding of, and did not understand, and had to overcome somehow by myself, because I thought that I had to be silent about it. And so I think, when you say boulders that shaped my life, I wouldn't say that these circumstances shaped my life, but I think rather the resilience and the frame of mind, or the strength of mind that I had to hold on to that spark in order to overcome. I think those are the things that shaped my life and made me who I am today.
That comes out so clearly in your words.
Thank you.
But I think too about your experiences as a child, when your parents left Malaysia and went to Africa and just left you alone in many ways. Like that type of abandonment was very similar to what Vince experienced, and that those are deep wounds that can be can alter your psyche forever.
Yeah, I think it builds. Trauma is trauma, right? And trauma reshapes your brain. It ultimately does change the way the brain works. And so I think without understanding much about trauma, I went through it, and I was able to survive it, and definitely change the way I am, or the way I think, and the way I process the world, because I have experienced such dire pain as a child. Yeah. So I was thinking, talking about family and children, I have been thinking about your wife. Can I ask you something about your wife? So you took on this big case, and this really still ongoing saga that you had made a decision to take on. But ultimately, I feel like that it's the village, which your wife is part of, who has to hold your back straight while you do it, right? So what was her true understanding? Or tell us her reaction when you first took it on, as opposed to what she says today. I'm very interested to know what she.
So my wife is a similar character to Daniel, who is Amelia's husband, and the two of them are they're kind of superheroes, really.
They are, yes.
So for us, this whole process was very insidious. Like it so slowly grew into our lives. Like it wasn't an advocacy project. Like at first, it was a truth telling project. But when we learned from a patient that Vince Gilmer was maybe getting out of prison and that maybe he might like to kill me because I had stolen his life, we had the same name, and things started to shift a little bit at that point. Like there's a fearful period of paranoia in my life at that time that really did affect our family. Like our family was wondering if we should stick around here in Nashville. They were wondering if I should leave that clinic and put more distance. But as you know, like pursuing any type of advocacy project requires a team. So my family, my kids, especially Deirdre, have been that amazingly fortified and resilient and very patient team who've supported the efforts of. It's been like a decade-long effort at this point to try to get the other Dr. Gilmer out of prison, and those kind of efforts don't happen without a team. So I've been really lucky to have this great team. Nice. My kids have been going to the prison since they were 4 and 6 years old for every Thanksgiving. So they've also been very proximate to what it means to be incarcerated as a mentally ill person.
So that strikes another question for me, where you say that you were anxiety ridden and you thought he was out to get you, and you had your wife and your children to think about, but you did the counterintuitive thing of getting closer to the threat than getting away from it. And what was the driving matter that allowed you to do that and then hold on to this point where it's not something that you did for a year and said, okay, I'm done, you're really seeing this through? What do you think it is that holds you to it?
I want to ask you that question too, but for me, it was a natural part of, I feel like, being a doctor, taking on this Hippocratic oath. This is what we do. We advocate, especially in family medicine. Our niche really is advocacy. So committing ourselves to something. And so that was what I intended to do. And one of my mentors is Albert Schweitzer, who died a long time ago, but he was a mentor because I worked at his hospital for a while. And his mantra was reverence for life. And he was a great example of committing himself to a life of service and reverence. I just thought that was what we were supposed to do. And so, that's what you want your doctor to do, right? You want them to advocate for you. So
that's why you want people to do that. But I don't think there's many people who actually go out executing the plans and things that you have. So
I think
congratulations on that.
No, I don't think I'm exceptional. I think
this is very inspiring of what you're doing. We aspire to do the things that you do.
This is what so many people in our community do already. My boss is sitting over here, so I'm going to put in a little plug for Mayhack. At Mayhack, we do so many things like this. We have projects to tackle the opioids, addiction, epidemic. We have projects to look at mental health, to put nurses in schools who take care of children's mental health, to on and on. This is what a lot of community, grassroots medicine is. This. It's advocacy. It's what. So Brian over here does in his life as a pediatrician. So this is, if you look around and see the people that are doing advocacy work like yourself, what pushed you to taking your personal story and making it very big and very public? You did this for a reason. What was it?
So main reason, of course, is that I want to be part of the change that happens. I see that it's going to happen and I want to push for it to happen. But I think another part of me also, I'm encouraged by other people who have experienced the same experiences as I have. I think I was floored, I was shocked at how many people actually have experienced the trauma and mental illness like I have. And 1 in 5 people in America have a mental illness, right? And you hear that number, you hear it all the time, and you don't actually see it. But then since I've published my book, I've had people come up to me and share their experiences. And I realized that this is a bigger problem, but I also realized that it is a fixable problem. Fixable by way of normalizing it, normalizing mental health for everybody, access to mental health for everybody. And I do a little work, like you say, advocacy, where I do a little work with the mental health court, which is a diversion court in Kentucky. In the city that I live in, we have a diversion court that helps people who have mental illness, keeps them from being incarcerated, and helps them walk a path of healing as a means of rehabilitation instead of incarceration. I think that's the goal. The goal with both our work is to see a world where incarceration is not the answer to crime. Rather, we want to see more rehabilitation, and especially for people with mental illnesses that can be addressed, that I've seen addressed in the court system. And I've been doing work with them, and I see how effective a path of healing can be for healing. Like just being able to show that there's a path forward, that this is the path that you can take towards healing, and what a big change that makes in a person's life, not even like having walked the path yet. And so that's I guess my passion with my work and my book. Like the book has become a platform for me to be able to voice my thoughts about normalizing mental health.
I love how you said that. It's very much like what I think you articulate better than I do. That was what I was trying to also do as a sort of a flagship concept too, that we can actually heal crime. That mental illness is, to be clear, not all mentally ill people commit crimes, but 40% of people who are in prison have severe mental illness. 10 times more people with mental illness live in prisons than in our mental hospitals, if you want to do that math. I mean, it's
the largest mental health care facility is a prison.
Cook County Jail in Chicago. The second one is the LA jail. And the third one is Rikers Island in New York. So this is a very similar mission that we have, like recognizing firstly that mental illness is a disease that can be treated. Like the brain is an organ, just like the heart, and we consider the heart a treatable, stentable, as Dr. Hathaway does, organ. We must treat mental illness as well, or recognize at least that we are all on this path sometimes towards mental illness. And in the prison system, my daughter just read a paper called Hospitals, not Prisons. Oh. Or hey, no, Hospitals, Not Handcuffs is what she called it. Yeah.
That's very clever. What was I going to ask you here? Let's see. Oh, yeah, beyond the Hippocratic Oath, like we're talking about advocacy and we're talking about helping people at large. I'm interested to know like how you welcomed Vince into your family and how that then in itself is a large stigma around people who have been convicted, or people who are incarcerated. There's this huge stigma around them and the value of them as members of society. And you have welcomed him into your family, spending Thanksgiving with him, and your children have met him and spent time with him. Can you tell us a bit more about what was the loophole that allowed you to welcome him into your family?
I'm not sure there was
beyond being just a doctor.
Well, the loophole was that we decided to commit ourselves to a relationship with him and to discovering him. And so that was the commitment we made, like to understanding him as a human, just as, the number of people like Daniel and the number of people who worked with you over the years wanted to understand who you were as a human, that you're not a diagnosis, you're a human. Vince Gilmer was beginning to realize that he was just a diagnosis. And unfortunately, he was diagnosed as a malingerer. He was faking symptoms. So imagine for a moment during your trajectory, discovering yourself, if no one believed what you were saying. And rather than receiving help, you received, punishment. How that would have been so different, like for you. That's what like really, really connected me, I think, to him was realizing how vulnerable so many of these incarcerated people are, especially those with mental illness.
so much empathy and compassion and understanding I see that you have, that we can only wish that like the rest of us can have, right? Yes, I mean, I say this like it's aspirational to be able to love to that extent and to be giving and empathetic, and that's to be able to feel that much. So I definitely kudos to you. Like I'm very humbled to be in your company.
Likewise. But I think both of our books are acts of service.
I would like to think so. I hope that is what people get when they pick up a copy of Enough and finish it, that there is a sense of hope and there is a sense of being seen, being valued, being being in existence. I think that's what I hope that people, like you said, that Vince wants to feel those things. And I think that's the same had been for me when I wrote this book, was I was feeling a lot lost and invisible. And now I feel like with this, when people read it, I hope that they feel seen.
And how does it feel now to be so visible and so seen? And how does that translate into the service that you're pushing the book towards?
I think at first it was daunting, it was scary. It was definitely very nerve-wracking to think that everybody would know my story and would judge me and have judgment for my past and my life and what's to come. I think people are very good with judgment, like being able to deal judgment for the future, because they think that they understand your past, and that was the risk I was taking in writing this book. But I think that like I said earlier, I own my truth and I'm in my own skin and I'm able to stand without the shield of shame and guilt and fear and the stigma, which is what I want to talk about, which I try to talk about as much as I can, because I don't think we can ever talk enough about it, normalizing mental health and trying to rid ourselves of the stigma and belief systems that we have surrounding it, in order to allow for people to access health care, allow people to access healing, allow people to access themselves, their sense of self, which is shrouded in stigma when it comes to mental illness.
I'm just curious what your experience was with the medical system as you began to discover who you were.
Like, you mean before or after I wrote the book? Before I wrote the book, I wrote this book because of my experiences with the mental health care professionals. I've had physicians who told me that I should never be a mother, that I would never be able to be a mother. And I find, for one, now that I'm on this side, I'm way far distance from where I was then. I realized that it was something that was possible. I realize now that it is possible. I'm doing it. I have children who are thriving. They're happy. They're good in school. They're happy at school. They have social networks. They have social support systems. And I provide that to them. And as a mother, I think I am successful. But, however, I wish I was told that instead of saying that I would not be able to be a mother, I wish that I had been told that there was a path to healing. I wish that I was told that it is possible. However, these are the steps you will need to take. You will need to build a support system, a support network. You will need to be on these medications. You will need to see a therapist regularly. You will need to have an emergency plan, or whatever those things that I have learned over the years. I wish that those were the things that were told to me, instead of something around that was guided by stigma. You're not going to be able to be a mother. Or a physician had suggested to me that I see a relationship therapist that was specialized in bipolar disorder, because I would not be able to have a relationship with my partner, because people who had bipolar were not able to hold on to relationships or manage relationships. And so I now understand that it is possible. I wish someone told me that there would be challenges, but these are the steps. But you know, that's where I'm getting at with this whole book, self-advocacy and finding the answers and a path to healing that exists that people don't usually tell you about because of the stigma. And I want that stigma gone. I think it's too old, it's dated, it is time for us to be done with it, and it's time for us to walk towards healing loudly and proudly. Like if you broke your leg, you wouldn't be hiding it, right? You wouldn't be hiding it at home. But if you were mentally ill, a lot of us want to pretend, put on a mask and pretend that everything's okay in order to get by. And so I want to see a world where that is no longer the truth, that if you were not doing well mentally, you would be able to get treatment for it and not be shoved with the stigma around it.
So important. So important for us as clinicians to help advocate for all people with mental illness. Yeah. I'm just realizing we have 15 minutes. We would love to have a conversation with you all. And thank you so much.
Thank you.
I think you said something earlier in your talk about how you had to make some decisions about what to do and be proactive in your own, I think, recovery. But if the person doesn't want it, it's a lot like AA or you know, of course, if they don't want to do anything. But what am I going to do? 2 years person going to cover herself? I don't know.
Did you find that it was largely you led your wellness, or did someone give you an answer that worked?
So mine was with my husband. Like, so we were together, we were dating back then. And he was convinced that my behaviors were not acceptable behaviors. He said, like, this is not working out. I had moved to be with him, and I'm going to tell the whole book now. It's in the book, but yeah, so he kind of gave me a gentle ultimatum that I needed to seek help, give it a try, or that it wouldn't work out between us. And that he would be, but he promised that he would be there as a support system for me, that he would be there for me and he would walk me through it. He came to my first few sessions of therapy, and I'm simplifying this. Is as you understood, like, it's not a simple conversation as in you need to go and see the doctor, or we're over, or you need to see the doctor, or like I'm out of here, we're not having this conversation anymore. It's never a simple conversation, especially in a state.
It's a lifetime of work.
Yes. So I think that he gave me a space to feel safe, that I had scaffolding around me, that if I fell, I wouldn't fall too far, that he would be there to hold me. And I trusted it. I found it in me to trust him and allow him to be part of my healing. And I think that worked for me.
But you had to make a decision to do something.
Yes, I did.
You had to be some proactive.
Yes, I did.
Instead of somebody else making it all magically.
Yes.
We have a question from the at-home audience about Ms. Gilmer, and just asking after him, basically, what he is and how he's doing.
So there's a new postscript in the paperback that came out last week that gives a little bit of an update, and unfortunately the update that's in the back of the book is not actually what happened. And so we are looking for a hospital still. So Vince Gilmer is the only free clemency granted incarcerated person in America who's still behind bars and has been so as a free man for 15 months. He's unique. And the update is that it is very hard to get a person who's incarcerated, who's been convicted of murder despite being granted clemency, into a hospital setting. And we've tried all options. And so far, we do have a budding option. Our local hospital here in Asheville decided not to take Vince, but we have another option that we may have some more information about soon. So that's our goal. We did a fundraiser and raised $100,000 to to buy him a bed in a private place, and it's still almost impossible to find that bed. The reason for that is because we're exceptionally under-resourced regarding hospital and psychiatric beds in America. And it's not just a Nashville problem. It's a problem in every community throughout the United States. Adam.
I have a first appreciation for the two of you telling your story, and thanks for telling your story too, man. But also have a witness that I'm noticing two people who would make a really great collaboration and creating a sort of how to advocate for a difficult mental health situation book.
Mhm.
Obviously, it would have some, different character development that need to be in place. But I mean, what you just demonstrated is this ability to be able to manage and mitigate, and that's a path that's been walked that could be communicated to others who are wanting to make the same path.
Well, we were actually talking about this earlier, and Amelia gets, emails all the time from people asking about how they can begin their healing. I got another letter yesterday from an inmate in Arizona with schizophrenia who needs help getting out because nobody's helping him. Like there is I think, speaking about my book, but I really got the sense too from your book that it's an opportunity to reach out to other silos and to bridge them together. And so I think there could be some great collaboration there.
My second, I was just gonna say, that was my sister, she was talking about, when you go through all that, you're looking for the pamphlet, like, this is crazy. This is crazy. This is what it looked, here's what happened, there's nothing. Nanny, the Copestone, the providers themselves, I mean, it's really a catch as catch can. You do your best, there's no system. You go to a breast, there's a great New York Times article, you guys may have seen it, but you have breast cancer, and it's like there's a whole panel set up. There's the guy, there's the oncologist, there's the surgeon, but you go through mental illness and there's no panel, there's no system, there's no next step. Here's how treatment, here's where you get better. And I don't understand, it's super individual, but there's just no play by play of where to go, how to go, who to go.
A lot depends on where you live as well.
A lot
Like in
depends on where you
rural
Well,
America.
I mean, the back should be like the green book for great, well, if you're in Minnesota, here's the place you want to be. Really, it's everywhere you are. It's like, you might have a house to go to, you might have some halfway houses. I mean, we looked so many resources that it's almost silly. You say the numbers, millions of people are dealing with this, and millions of families, if you're lucky enough to have them, don't have where do you start? Totally capable, Google capable people know where to start. You just.
It's
I think
It's so hard.
there
It's
is
so
a
hard.
beginning, though there is a start to that. Though. Like when if you are suffering from a condition, I think your first easiest step to take is a family physician like yourself, right?
This is what we advocate in family medicine to
Right.
or in pediatrics, like that have a home, a medical home. That's where it begins. But the problem in America is that not everybody has medical
And
home.
you went to Minnie Jones. Minnie Jones said, we don't want to handle your medicine. The medicine was handled by, it is not easy.
And your position, your family position, I love mine, but you get 15 minutes, she on the bridge, how can you move it? You get 15 minutes. Are you okay, mentally? You don't want to walk the bridge.
It's just,
"No, okay.
and honestly, we don't have to keep talking about ours. It just is mind blowing a little bit, all the resources that you guys have had access to. It's hard to navigate.
A little bit along those lines, I just happened to look on my phone. Ringer turned off. And I saw that as of December 31 of 2020, North Carolina had 29,461 prisoners. Your guess as to, let's say 30,000, your guess as to how many of those are mentally suffering with mental issues?
40%.
About half.
Okay. And that is a massive number for which we have no effective system. Is that right? We have a state hospital in Broughton and some others.
There are three in North Carolina. There are 3 public mental hospitals that have very long waiting lists. So that cumulatively in America, it's like between 800,000 and 1 million people incarcerated people with mental illness who, and there's a word for this, it's called TransInstitutionalization. So this happened back in the Reagan era when patients who were previously in a more resourced behavioral health settings were shifted to their communities, then shifted to the streets, and then shifted into our prison system.
So it took a massive funding to get this back on track.
Massive funding, but there's good news. Like our legislature is passing a bill that will enact $1 billion in North Carolina that will be devoted purely towards increased psychiatric resources, increased resources towards the opioid epidemic, and also targeting mental illness and incarcerated people. Yeah, so North Carolina's on the brink of being quite a leader.
So it's the top of the hour at 7 o'clock. We started a couple minutes late, so we're going to take one more question. This gentleman right back here.
Really appreciate both of your stories. Of course, I know that's pretty well for many years since it began. Knew Dr. Gilmer myself. The thing I struggle with and I have a question about is, where does accountability come into play for the other Dr. Gilmer? In a man who clearly had mental illness, was in an early phase or an early phase of the manifestation of his mental illness, who without question in my mind committed an unspeakably heinous crime. And I struggle with trying to figure out, did he know right from wrong? How can you go back to work the next day, take care of people in a normal fashion and still have done that? And what, in your opinion, having spent so much of the last 10, 15 years exploring this, what does accountability look like in that circumstance when it's put up against compassion and doing the right thing for him? Where do those two intersect, and how do we address that?
This is the ultimate question that is the hardest to answer. So thank you, Dr. Hathaway, for bringing that question. For the audience at home, the question is, where do we bridge accountability with mental illness? How do we hold people accountable while recognizing the dignity and the humanity that we must still continue to look for in mentally ill people? And this is a really hard question because, part of the question for many of us is that we're still historically wed to this notion of punishment. We're still historically wed to this notion of racism in a way, which is, racism towards the mentally ill, and it's in our bones. And, that's why in the book, I really wanted to explore looking at this very question through a clinical lens. And when you look at it strictly as it through a clinician's eyes, not as a judge, not as a prosecutor, not as someone who's buying stock in the the system of professional mass incarceration. But when you look at what happened to him in that moment and you dissect his brain, which was the goal of the book, looking at what formed this man's mind. And you realize that in that moment, he was delusional. In that moment, it was the accumulation of years of sexual abuse, the accumulation of years of trauma, the years of chronic depression and anxiety. But when are those people still held, when should they be held accountable? I mean, this is what, many people ask. Like, we can't just turn everybody out to the streets, they ask. But when we see it through clinical eyes, we see that, it's that treating someone in a hospital is holding them accountable too. Putting Vince in a hospital setting for life is holding him accountable. It doesn't resolve what happened. It doesn't absolve him from the killing that happened. But it's, through a clinical lens, you begin to understand that this is part of our human nature and that we have this capacity to become delusional and to lose capacity. And in that moment, he had no capacity. So for me, it's an easy answer. He was not in control of his mind. But to hold him accountable, we have to do that to some degree. And that means treatment. That means healing.